Miss Academy choose to host these webinars with all these brilliant speakers? What specific goals or objectives do we all hope to achieve by bringing together experts and stakeholders in this field? Well, we all want to be a part of food safety community to address pressing issues, and I know there are a lot of them, share expertise, and foster collaboration. Exploring topics from various angles, bringing experts together, looking at technological innovations, and industry best practice. Today, it's a pleasure to me to introduce you to Bill Marler, a well-known US food safety lawyer. You know, the first task on my morning agenda is to read the food safety news and update our recall and notification list. Keeping up to date on developments in the realm of food safety isn't confined only to the US. I also diligently monitor alerts from various European food safety newsletters. It's essential to remain informed about global food safety trends and incidents. But now, Bill, now let's listen to your presentation and remember to prepare your questions for the insightful Q&A follows, dear guests. Feel free to submit your questions via chat. In case we run short on time, we'll assure that you will be answered on the Nemis Academy webpage to all your questions. So please, Bill, who are you?
Well, thanks. It's a little early here in Seattle, but we'll get going here. So good to see you.
Thank to you to be a part of this.
Second. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. What I'd like to do today is, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'd like to, focus a little on obviously food safety, but to talk a little bit about how, litigation, both in the United States, and we're seeing more and more of it around the world, and many of those I've been involved in as a consultant. But how sometimes litigation, which I think in many respects is the second worst result that could happen to a company after sickening their customers, but how sometimes litigation we learn things about how to make the system better. And hopefully I can leave that with you guys. I know we have a very short time and I want to leave a lot of time for questions. So let me just give you a little background on strict product liability in the US. And for any company that exports products to the US, imports products to the United States, you're going to have to deal with the fact that, US has grown up as a bit more litigious society than others, and that's just a reality. And then food producers importing food, exporting food to the US, are going to have to deal with it. Strict liability focuses on the manufacturer of the food product. And it asks the question is, was that product unsafe? And obviously, if it has, one of the pathogens that's sitting behind me, in the United States, it's deemed to be unsafe. And if the product caused injury, that manufacturer is going to be held what's known as strictly liable. Negligence is a little different concept in the United States, and it focuses on the seller of the product. And did the seller act reasonably? A good example I give frequently is many years ago, I was involved in an unpasteurized juice case. It was the Odwalla apple juice case. And the manufacturer clearly was Odwalla. They ground the apples. They turned it into kids' apple juice. It was sold at Starbucks. Starbucks opened the can and poured it in a cup and sold it as kids' apple juice. It was unpasteurized. And in 1996, I chose not to sue Starbucks because I felt that in 1996, it wasn't unreasonable to sell unpasteurized juice to a kid in a commercial setting. Same facts today, I would, because I think selling unpasteurized juice, especially in a commercial setting, is unreasonable. Punitive damages, criminal liability, pretty rare in the United States, but we'll talk a little bit more about those. But the focus there is, did that company have a conscious disregard for a known food safety risk? So who's a manufacturer? The definition of manufacturer is incredibly broad. It's a product seller who designs, produces, makes, fabricates, constructs, or remanufactures a relevant product or component part of a product before its sale to consumer. Incredibly broad definition. So a lot of times companies go, well, wait a second, if we do everything we can do, and I still make somebody sick, you can sue me. And the answer is yes. With strict product liability, the answer is yes. And the only defense is prevention. It doesn't matter if you took all reasonable precautions. If you make someone sick, you're going to pay, and wishful thinking doesn't help. So let's talk a little bit as litigation is an incentive. And in the 31 years since Jack in the Box, which is hard to imagine, these exhibits that I got during the course of discovery, I think are really informative. And I think one of the main things that I like to leave people with is the fact that so many of these foodborne illness outbreaks are completely preventable. The real issue is, whether or not you have, people in positions of authority that are paying attention to sort of, warning signs. And Jack in the Box clearly had warning signs. And we'll go back a little bit in history and talk about that. One of the things I think people maybe forgotten is that, in 1992, the only state in the country that had increased the cook times to 55 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature for hamburgers was the state of Washington. The FDA has a food code, and that is recommended to all states, but states in the United States have a lot of flexibilities to deal with laws. And when it comes to the food code, states can increase the warnings, increase the regulations, but they can't decrease them. So in 1992, there had been a series of E. coli 0157H7 clustered illnesses in the state of Washington, and actually even before then, and that the health departments had linked it to ground beef. So, to get ahead of the problem, what the state of Washington did was increase the cook times
Okay, excuse me to all, but it seems somehow that Bill freeze, and we're trying to get on and look at this technical issue. I think Alina, my dear colleague, is right on now. To look at it, it can happen. Sorry for this. Well, I hope that Bill's coming back soon. Okay, somebody's going to take a coffee. Bill is back again.
Yeah, sorry, my internet went down. I'm back now. My apologies.
No
So
problem. Some of
can I
them
get,
went. Yes, you can continue. No problem at all.
okay, my apologies. My internet went down.
Great, you are back
So,
again.
all right. So, my apologies. The internet went down here. I live on an island across from Seattle, and sometimes the internet's a little unstable. My apologies. But as I was saying, the state of Washington, which is up in the northwest corner of the United States, had a series of E. coli 0157 outbreaks clusters linked to ground beef, and they were really trying to get ahead of it by, one, making E. coli 0157 a reportable bacterial disease, and secondly, increasing the cook times from 140 to 155 internal temperature for hamburgers, Fahrenheit. So they disseminated all that information in early 1992 to all restaurants in the state of Washington, including Jack in the Boxes, and provided that same information to corporate headquarters of franchised operations throughout the United States, including Jack in the Box's corporate headquarters in California. So they were disseminating this information. They're going to restaurants. They were training new restaurants about the need for increased cook times in hamburgers. And there was an interesting document that got generated that we wound up getting during the course of the investigation. And it was in the suggestion box that came from an employee of Jack in the Box from the Bellingham, which is right across the border from Vancouver. And in June of 19,
Sorry,
in
Bill.
June,
Excuse me,
yes,
Bill. Is it okay for you if Alina shares your presentation so you have the slides?
you don't see my slides?
No, it's okay.
All right. No, it's all right. I have it as a share slide, and oh, how about now?
No, not yet. But if it's really, Alina has no problem to share the presentation for you. And you talk.
You can't see it?
No, not yet.
How about now?
Still no, just the two of us on the screen.
You know, I hate to tell you, but I don't. It's not. If she wants to, she's got
Yes.
it. And she wants to try to share it, and then I can see it. That would be
Yeah,
great.
Alina will do it. So she's our technical guy. Alina?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, guys, to interrupt you, but right now we see the screen of Bill. So maybe give another try.
You see my screen?
Yes, right now, yes.
You see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we could see my screen.
Right now, yes. Right now, yes. So,
Can you see my screen now?
perfect.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's get back to where we were. My apologies for the technical difficulties. We're obviously a ways away from each other, and sometimes it just doesn't work quite well. So in any event, In June of 1992, so now we're several months before the outbreak that occurred in January of 1993, a shift leader, an employee of a Jack in the Box in the state of Washington, sent this note to corporate headquarters. It says, describe the change. I think regular patties should cook longer. They don't get done and we have customer complaints. Describe the benefit. If we change this, we'll be making our burgers done and edible. So what did you think that Jack in the Box corporate headquarters would have done with such a warning, again, several months before the outbreak? They wrote her back, said, Wendy, we'd like to acknowledge the time and effort you've taken to contribute to the success of Jack in the Box by enclosing this pen highlighter. Each person submitting a suggestion is eligible to receive one gift per quarter with their first suggestion. And then what did they do? Well, we learned during the course of discovery that they actually tried to see if they could make their burgers done and edible. And they did testing in the corporate kitchens at Jack in the Box headquarters in San Diego, California. And when I knew that is that we got thousands and thousands of pages of relatively blank documents, but with little boxes, and inside the little boxes were circles with numbers, 132, 150, 142. Those were actually testing to see if they could make the hamburgers hit 155 or more within the constraints that they wanted, which was a 2-minute cook time, because Jack in the Box was a fast food restaurant. And what they wrote Wendy back in all of the rest of the franchises and operations throughout the United States in August of 1992, and again, before the outbreak happened. We've researched your suggestion and determined with the variability of our grill temperatures, 350 to 400 Fahrenheit, the 2-minute cook time is appropriate. And so what was happening is the company was not focused on 155 as the new temperature. They were focused on the 2-minute cook time. And at 350, these grills wouldn't cook to 155. At 400, they would cook to 155 or more. The problem is that the older grills were cooler, the newer grills were hot, and it happened to be that there were a lot of older grills in the state of Washington. So months before this outbreak, Jack in the Box knew about this new regulation in the state of Washington and chose to essentially ignore it because the 2-minute cook time was more important. And ultimately, it happened that, over 650 people sick, 4 children died, and literally nearly 50 kids suffered acute kidney failure. There were a lot of bad things, obviously, that happened in the Jack in the Box era, but one of the things that really happened that, started, I think, the trend towards, really government and industry trying to do the right thing when it comes to food safety is the work that Mike Taylor, when he was at FSIS, did to deem E. coli 0157 an adulterant. And here's the language from his speech that he gave in 1994 to the American Meat Institute. And he says, to clarify an important legal point, we consider raw ground beef that is contaminated with E. coli 0157H7 to be adulterated within the meaning of the Federal Meat Inspection Act. We are prepared to use the Act's enforcement tools as necessary to exclude adulterated product from commerce. Finally, we plan to conduct targeted sampling and testing of raw ground beef at plants and in the marketplace for possible contamination. And what did that do? Requiring the FDA or the USDA to do testing in retail, it prompted a lot of recalls. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a recall of the United States, 500,000 pounds here, 1 million pounds here, multiple millions of pounds. That started costing the industry a lot of money, including lawsuits that I brought on behalf of victims for some of the outbreaks that occurred post Jack in the Box. And those two things really sort of forced the hand of the industry because it was getting too expensive. The industry to work with government to, really do an amazing thing. And that amazing thing was, despite a few kerfuffles at the very beginning where, the meat industry's reaction was that, how can FSIS, which is Food Safety Inspection Services, treat hamburger meat as an adulterant subject to enforcement strategies while not applying the same salmonella standard to broilers. This is probably one of the reasons why, at least in part, I agree with the meat industry. In my view, there really is no rationale, legal rationale for differentiating E. coli in hamburger and salmonella in broilers. So the industry originally sued the FDA, USDA, the USDA eventually won. And the thing that happened was, a positive trend line. Marler Clark revenue decreased substantially. 90% of my law firm revenue in the late 90s, early 2000s was E. coli cases linked to hamburger. And, frankly, that's nearly zero. I mean, we haven't had an E. coli outbreak of any size, for decades. Doesn't mean that, you could eat raw hamburger but the industry and government working together, really did an amazing thing to, see that E. coli 0157H7 is not known necessarily anymore as the hamburger disease. And, I think the work by industry and government have saved countless lives and countless tragedies. One of the things I've really learned over the last 30 years of doing this kind of work is that it really is a global food economy. And, what happens within, the supply chain impacts companies who provide food around the world, whether, it's the US exporting E. coli contaminated romaine lettuce to our friends in the north in Canada, or, getting lead tainted cinnamon from a global food supply that goes into applesauce for children in the US. We really do need to pay attention to, all parts of the supply chain. And, imports to the United States, and I say this, imports, at least in my view, are still a relatively small part of, the reason why outbreaks occur in the United States. Like the US and many countries, we have a tendency to think our ways are better than others and that our ways are potentially cleaner than others. We've learned, the hard way in the US, especially with respect to leafy greens, that certainly isn't the case. But, we've seen more and more imports that have come in. And of course, we see outbreaks. And, two hepatitis A outbreaks from 2016, one linked to scallops from the Philippines and another linked to strawberries from Egypt, caused hundreds and hundreds of illnesses and including a death in Hawaii. Many of you might have known about this horrible listeria outbreak in South Africa from 2018. I've been involved with the lawyers there as a consultant, but what an incredible tragedy. Over 1,000 people sick. Most of the cases reported in 2017. Females were the vast majority of the people. Ages of people who were sick were from children who were born prematurely to people that are as old as 92, and 204 patients were known to have died, mostly children. But getting back to the United States, there was an outbreak of E. coli linked to spinach in 2006 that sickened 205 people, killed 5 people in the United States. And it was a problem all over the United States. And it was the leafy green industry really said, hey, we're going to do right. We're going to get our act together. And they implemented a lot of self-regulation, in part to sort of thwart the FDA from, doing its own sets of regulations, which frankly came much later. But for a few years, the outbreaks still happened, but they weren't large. And then in 2018, over 240 people sickened from over 30 states. 8 illnesses were reported in Canada. 96 people were hospitalized, so 48% of those individuals were hospitalized. 27 people developed hemolytic uremic syndrome, which is the bad form of an E. coli infection. And there were 5 deaths in Arkansas, California, Minnesota, and New York. The traceback done by the FDA was quite thorough. But as you can see, or maybe see from the slides, they didn't name names. The one thing that I had the ability to do as a lawyer is that you see on the far left side where it says points of service, we would know, generally speaking, where our clients consume food. And it might have been at a restaurant or purchasing in a grocery store. We would then know, where the point of service was. We would sue that restaurant or that grocery store, and then we would work our way backwards to the distribution centers, processors, growers, and ultimately sometimes we'd get right to the farm level. And it was a real amazing experience to sort of, in many respects, redo this FDA traceback diagram, but by filling in the names of the players who were involved in the outbreak. And really, to me, there was very little, very little doubt, so to speak, of how this outbreak happened. This is Yuma, a picture of aerial view of Yuma, Arizona. This is a 100,000 cow feedlot. It runs right along the Welton Canal, which is a source of water for irrigation. The outbreak strain of the pathogen was found in the irrigation water, and you can see the leafy greens as far as the eye can see. This is still the case in the United States. This is still in operation, and it's really I view as a failure of the FDA, USDA, and the industry to sort of deal with environmental problems that creep into our food supply. Are things different today? Some of you might recognize these 2 gentlemen, Stuart Parnell and Sam Lightsey, from the Peanut Corporation of America outbreak. It started with a little salmonella. Over 714 people were culture positive. And we know from CDC statistics that about 38 additional people are sick for every person counted. So you can see that this outbreak was significantly large, both in the US and in Canada. Ages range from less than 1 to 98 years. 24% of the people were hospitalized, and there were 9 deaths. There were congressional hearings, including, this was a Congress member from Oregon who held up this jar and asked Mr. Parnell to eat out of this jar, and Mr. Parnell took the 5th Amendment. But we got a lot of emails from the litigation talking about turning them loose. He's talking about, shipping potentially contaminated product, ordered products identified with salmonella to be shipped anyways because destroying product was costing them money. He insisted that early on that the outbreak didn't happen, but that obviously was not the case. And he goes through this about once a week. He wrote in a June 28th email, "I'll hold my breath again." So what we learned during the course of both this investigation and the congressional hearings is that Stuart Parnell had requirements by manufacturers, and even though Peanut Corporation only manufactured about 2% of the peanut products in the United States, that those peanut products went into thousands, and we're talking 3,000s of products all over the United States. And some of the large manufacturers had requirements certificates of analysis that they required testing each lot. And what would, Stuart Parnell would do was we was doing that, but getting positive tests. They then came up with the idea of taking multiple samples of one lot, sending out to multiple labs, hoping to get a negative result on one of the samples, which they sometimes did. And they would use those knowing that the other samples tested positive. And then all 5 of them would come back positive, and they started forging certificates of analysis to say they were negative when they were in fact positive. So they absolutely knew that they were, more likely than not selling contaminated product into the market. And we know they in fact did that because of the illnesses and deaths that occurred. They ultimately were charged by the U.S. Justice Department with 76 count federal indictment. Stuart Parnell, Michael Parnell, Sam Lightsey, plant manager, operator, Mary Wilkerson, quality assurance manager, and Dan Kilgore, the plant manager. The allegations included mail fraud and wire fraud because sometimes they emailed the certificates of analysis, sometimes they mailed it. But under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, it's a felony to introduce adulterated, misbranded food into interstate commerce with intent to defraud and mislead, and conspiracy. So they were facing, each count is $1 million fine and 10 years in prison. So you can see that they were facing a lot of time in jail. In fact, Sam Lightsey and Dan Kilgore pled guilty and were sentenced to a lesser offense. Mary Wilkerson, Michael Parnell, and Stuart Parnell went to trial. The jury found Mary Wilkerson guilty on 5 federal indictments. Stuart Parnell and Michael Parnell, I think, were both found guilty of over 70 violations. Stuart and Michael were sentenced to 28 and 20 years in prison, Mary Wilkerson to 5. But in the United States, under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, criminal sanctions, albeit misdemeanors, which are only a year in jail and a $250,000 fine, a misdemeanor conviction under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act does not require proof of fraudulent intent or even knowing or willful conduct. It really just requires that a person in a position of responsibility could have solved the problem before it became a larger one. And it doesn't really require that an outbreak occur. Frankly, it doesn't even require that a recall occur. It really requires that you are manufacturing food under unsanitary conditions. The FDA has been a bit more aggressive. Their Office of Criminal Investigation has been a bit more aggressive on criminal sanctions over the course of the last couple of decades than they were when I first started. Criminal sanctions, as I said, are rare, but they're large. Bluebell ice cream. The president went on trial last August on a felony charge stemming from the 2016 listeria outbreak. He was actually found innocent of that felony charge. However, the company paid a $19.5 million fine after there were 10 sick with 3 deaths linked to their ice cream. ConAgra, which is a branded company in the United States, sells a lot of different products. They were linked to a salmonella-tainted peanut butter outbreak before the Peanut Corporation of America outbreak that sickened 700 people. But they were also involved in several other E. coli and salmonella outbreaks. And I really think it was just sort of the volume of the problem that caused them to get a fine. Chipotle was involved in E. coli, salmonella, and norovirus outbreaks in 2015 and suffered a $25 million fine. Wright County Egg, linked to salmonella outbreak that sickened literally tens of thousands of U.S. citizens. There was a 500 million eggs recalled. They had a $7 million fine, and the owner spent 3 months in jail. Odwalla, we talked about earlier, that apple juice company paid a $1.5 million fine in 1996. And Jensen Farms the company that was involved with a listeria outbreak linked to cantaloupe, pled guilty to 5 counts after sickening 148 people with 33 dead. So, going through this, companies could feel a bit depressed. But again, I go back to, really every outbreak I've been involved in has had warning signs like the Jack in the Box sign or, the PCA, knowingly do something. There are signs before an outbreak happens that a plant or a company is having problems. So, what do companies do to, plan against litigation and plan against outbreaks? It's really identifying the hazards. Having a HACCP plan and having the committed people to enforce that HACCP plan is incredibly important. We talk a lot about the culture. I teach a class with Frank Yanis, who's really been one of the main proponents of a food safety culture. And I think, part of what I think is important for having a food safety culture is having people aware enough of those warning signs that you catch problems before they actually blow up in your face. And I think one of the other things that I tell companies to do is, involve your vendors, add them into the conversation because, it only takes one ingredient that's contaminated to ruin, a product that's manufactured or a product that goes into a restaurant. Does the supplier, the vendor have a plan? Are they committed to food safety like you are? Do you ever visit them? Do you make them realize how important it is? So many times, big restaurants and big box stores, rely on lawyers and contracts to put the onus on the vendors and suppliers to, give them good, healthful ingredients. And that's all well and good. But, just having a contract that requires it and just having lawyers that might beat up on the vendor and supplier if something goes wrong, it's much better to figure these problems out, to really involve the vendors, regardless of the lawyers. Another thing I tell companies all the time is that, regulators are your best friends. In my experience, yes, regulators can, sometimes be the food police, but usually that's when something egregious has happened. Most of the time, all of these organizations sort of view themselves as educators. And, if a company reaches out to ask for assistance and ask for services, many of these organizations would be there readily available to help. So things I've learned, and that I've tried to tell companies it's a good idea to pay attention to is, arm yourself with good current information. Pay attention, to the information that's out there. Have people who have direct communication with decision makers within your company. So if there's new data about food safety, there's new methodologies about making your food safer, that they have a place to go to talk to people in authority that are going to make the right decisions. Being proactive, again, it's sort of like, looking for good information is being proactive, between doing nothing and being proactive is the right thing to do. And again, it's like I just said in the earlier slide, making food safety part of everything, your suppliers and your customers do. So many times, customers are not as informed about risks of foodborne illness or the necessity to keep hot things hot and cold things cold and to, use gloves as appropriate, to wash their hands, to, cook products thoroughly, to, clean and separate and chill. Those are all things that I think, sometimes companies in the desire to sell a product minimize the risk. And I think, educating consumers is really the right thing to do. Those of you that have read the book or seen Poisoned on Netflix, it's been an interesting ride. The Netflix movie, although I think a little frightening in some spots, I think has started a really interesting dialogue. And there's actually a discussion about doing a repeat and digging in a bit more, especially what consumers can do and what the industry can do and what government can do to prevent these outbreaks in the future. So with that, I'll take questions. I will stop sharing my screen and I will get back online.
So, oh, Bill, thanks you for that thrilling and a captive presentation. I'm a little bit a small fan of yours because I'm also like you over 30 years in that business, and I'm really always think, gosh, is it possible? Um, but I already have here good questions. I maybe just take the first or second one because the first one was already answered with your slides. You mentioned earlier that the sale of unpasteurized fruit juice is unreasonable. Why do some US states authorize the sale of unpasteurized milk, actually legalizing numerous Campylobacter outbreaks? Your slide.
Yeah, no, it's um, raw milk is. I'm actually involved in two raw milk outbreaks presently, where dozens of people have gotten sick. Fortunately, there have been no deaths, but people have gotten quite ill, and some have developed hemolytic uremic syndrome. Um, I don't really have a great explanation about um, raw milk in the U.S., especially states that allow it to be sold commercially, in a grocery store. And in fact, the state that I live in allows that. And I'll tell you a funny, well, not necessarily a funny story, but like I said, I live on an island, but it's a town. The island's as big as Manhattan, but we have about 30,000 people that live on it. So there's a high school and grocery stores, and there's actually a bridge on the far end of the island that connects up to the mainland. But if I wanted to drive to Seattle, it would take me 3 hours. I could take a ferry in 30 minutes. So you kind of situated in an odd place. But there's a store here on the island that a friend of mine owns. It's a feed store where I get my chicken feed, and he also has a little grocery store that sells produce and meat that is grown here on the island. And I walked in there one day and I was looking around at some of the produce and stuff, and I saw that they were selling raw milk from a farm that I had sued before. And so I asked the owner, I said, one child with hemolytic uremic syndrome or some child that suffers a brain injury, that's a tens of millions of dollar problem for you. And that farmer's not going to have that kind of insurance, and you're not going to have that insurance. And I don't really want to own a feed store. So I convinced him to stop selling, raw milk. But, the FDA bans the sale of interstate raw milk. So one company who may manufacture product in California can't sell it into commerce into another state. But within states, the way our federalist system operates, states are free to do kind of what they want to do. And some states, are, leaning more and more and more to food freedom as we forget about why we started pasteurizing juice or milk in the first place, as time has faded over massive Brucella outbreaks and foodborne illness outbreaks. As we forgot about them, we sort of tend to go backwards. And that's just an odd thing about certain places in the United States that I really don't have a great explanation for. But it's a problem, and it's an ongoing problem. And we're seeing more and more Campy outbreaks, Listeria outbreaks, Salmonella outbreaks, E. coli outbreaks linked to raw milk.
Okay, thank you very much. It's complicated. I see it.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, next question. We have time. Yes, we have still time. Have you developed any regulation in the States for other Aztec E. coli, like E. coli O26 and the rest
Yep.
of the family?
That's a good question. Actually, we have, and it was a petition that I filed in 2009 to expand what's deemed an adulterant to include other Shiga toxin producing E. coli's, including O26. It was interesting. I was at a conference, I think it was late 2007 in Washington, D.C., and it was about other Shiga toxin producing E. coli's and the prevalence of them. And, frankly, I'd been by then in the business for, over a decade, and I just didn't realize how big that problem was. And there were some people from the EU there that I think were just frankly shocked that we disallowed 0157, but in a sense allowed these other pathogens in our meat supply. And so that prompted me to petition the USDA to ban those. And in fact, in 2012, finally they did. So yeah, I mean, the Shiga toxins that we know of, as we call them the big six here in the US, all of those are now deemed adulterants and are not allowed in the food supply.
Wow, okay. Okay, we have another good question. What is your opinion on the FDA's fine of over $40 million fine on Family Dollar, Mr. Marler?
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, there were no reported illnesses. But again, this is where, the cleanliness of a facility and the risk of foodborne illness, where the FDA is trying to, in many respects, make an example of a company that, really had incredibly bad food safety management. And, it's in many respects, sometimes I think having these kinds of fines and these kind of public humiliations of these companies, is probably a good thing. It makes other companies aware that these things can happen, especially involving a criminal nature. Because, frankly, the whole idea is, try to incentivize companies to do the right thing. And, frankly, most companies try to do the right thing. Most companies do the right thing. Most companies don't poison their customers, and but there are actors that take shortcuts. Dollar store being one of them.
Okay, yes. I have another good question. You mentioned that FDA considers themselves as an educator. If so, why do we rarely learn about their root cause investigations and risk factors so others can learn from these lessons?
That's a good question, and probably I think that's changed over time. In the early 2000s, they would do root cause analysis, and in some outbreaks they do, like the listeria outbreak linked to cantaloupe. But frankly, I think the FDA in the last several years has sort of really failed to sort of get to the point. And I'll give you an example. It's the E. coli outbreaks linked to romaine lettuce. I think most of your listeners would be shocked to know that the FDA during that investigation could not go on to that feedlot to do testing to essentially find the root cause. I don't think anybody really questions that was the root cause of the situation, but they're not allowed to go onto private property by a lot of varied protections for farmers. And I think that's a failure. And I think the fact that we haven't seen real good enforcement of environmental laws as it relates to environmental contamination, and potentially leaving it up to citizens to sue some of these factory farms under various other legal theories like nuisance, because it's getting obviously we need cows and we need places for cows, but we've got to pay attention to their outflows and where that flow goes, and especially as it relates to almost ready to eat products like leafy greens.
Oh, here is just another question. Is there a regulation for irrigation water?
There is, but it's not as good as what we would hope. It's certainly not, drinking water quality, and it's an issue of, really contamination. And so that's another area where I think the, FDA really needs to step up and, really finalize some of the aspirations of the Food Safety Modernization Act, which would include the FDA water rule.
Oh, okay. Um, I think I have one question also.
Sure.
Okay, in your experience, Bill, how have recent advancements in technology such as whole genome sequencing, genetic testing, and traceability system impacted the landscape of foodborne illness litigation?
That's a great question. I think a great example of, the power of whole genome sequencing, and I really do, to me, what it does is it gives people a higher degree of assurance that what they're seeing is real. And what I mean by that is, if you go back to the 2015 Listeria outbreak linked to Bluebell ice cream. Bluebell ice cream, that outbreak was figured out in a kind of a really interesting way. A environmental health worker in South Carolina went to a grocery store and bought a bag of groceries to take back to the lab to do testing on, and to keep up on how to use their testing mechanisms, especially whole genome sequencing. So they went back and did that, and lo and behold, they found listeria in a unopened quart of Bluebell ice cream. They uploaded that whole genome sequence listeria to PulseNet, which is our database in the U.S. that looks at whole genome sequencing and pulse field gel electrophoresis. They uploaded that, and they found that there were a match to at least 3 illnesses that occurred in Kansas in the last few years. So they went and they investigated that. They found that the common denominator was Bluebell ice cream. Between the people who were hospitalized, their common denominators, they all ate Bluebell ice cream. That then prompted FDA to go to the factories, do more testing. They found more listeria in the plant, in the grains, on food contact surfaces. They uploaded that to PulseNet. They found more illnesses and some deaths that went back years. So what we do know about whole genome sequencing is it gives all of us a greater sense of assurance that these cases are linked. And when you find it also in a plant, or you find it in a product, it's essentially, that literal smoking gun that, tells you that you've got it right. And the question about getting back to root cause analysis, one of the things I think sometimes that doesn't convince companies that this was the cause is when you don't have that. We've gotten so excited about this technology. When you don't have it, you can have a tendency to go, oh, it wasn't us. But epidemiological evidence through whole genome sequencing, and it's always good to have environmental samples or product samples. But I think that helps companies understand that they really are the entity that's at fault. And I think that in the long run is a good thing.
Oh, yes, sir, you're right. Wow. I would have more questions, but I think we are running out of time, dear Bill. And I want to thank you again for your presentation, and also looking at the chat here. It was really interesting. And for me, it was captive and thrilling. I love this kind of. And well, that's it, actually. I just
Yeah.
want to tell
Well,
our
thanks.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
thank you very much. And sorry about the technical glitches. We are a few thousand miles away and a few hours earlier. So anyway, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for the great questions. And I wish you guys all the best of luck.
Thank the same to you. It was a pleasure. And for the guests, they're still here. Look at next time, on the 7th of May, we are talking about E. coli as a food safety hygiene indicator, yes or no. Stay tuned, press the button, and we'll see in 2 weeks' time. Have a nice day. Bye. Thanks a lot, Bill.
See you
And to
later.
all-
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.